The power went out at exactly 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in February, and I knew immediately it was going to be a problem because the temperature outside was already hovering around 12 degrees Fahrenheit in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, squinting at the brightness as I checked the utility company's website. According to their outage map, half of our neighborhood was dark, and the estimated restoration time was listed as unknown. That never meant anything good. I lived in Riverside Meadows, a planned community that had been built about 15 years ago on the eastern edge of Grand Rapids. The houses were nice enough, two-story colonials with decent yards, but the real estate agent had conveniently failed to mention that the homeowners association was run by a collection of the most controlling, power-hungry people I had ever encountered. At the top of that list was Brenda Patterson, a 52-year-old woman who had somehow convinced herself that being HOA president was equivalent to being the mayor of a small town. I pulled myself out of bed and made my way downstairs, already feeling the chills seeping into the house. My furnace was electric, which meant no power equaled no heat. I had learned that lesson the hard way during a brief outage last year, and since then, I had invested in what I considered to be the best backup heating solution available. I walked into my home office, where I kept my prized possession during the winter months, a commercial-grade space heater that I had purchased through a medical equipment supplier. The thing was a beast. It stood about 2 feet tall, was built like a tank, and had cost me nearly $800, but it was worth every penny. The heater was the same model used in hospital operating rooms and intensive care units, designed to maintain precise temperature control in critical environments. It had multiple safety features, including automatic shutoff, tip-over protection, and the ability to run continuously for days without overheating. The electrical components were hospital-grade, meaning they met standards far exceeding anything required for residential use. I plugged the heater into my backup power system, another investment I had made after last year's outage. I had installed a dedicated circuit with a small generator that could power essential items, my refrigerator, a few lights, and most importantly, my space heater. The generator hummed to life in the garage, and within minutes, warm air was flowing from the heater. By 6 in the morning, the temperature in my house had stabilized at a comfortable 68 degrees. I made coffee using my French press and hot water from the kettle on my gas stove, feeling pretty satisfied with my preparation. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light over the snow-covered street outside my window. That was when I saw Brenda Patterson marching up my driveway. She was wearing a puffy purple coat that made her look like an overstuffed grape, and her face was already twisted into that expression of righteous indignation that she wore so well. Her blonde hair, clearly dyed to cover the gray, was pulled back in a tight ponytail that seemed to stretch her face even more. I knew immediately that this was not going to be a pleasant conversation. The doorbell rang 3 times in quick succession, the kind of aggressive ringing that suggested the person on the other side had no patience whatsoever. I took a slow sip of my coffee before walking to the door and opening it. "Good morning, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Adam," she said sharply, not bothering with pleasantries. "I need to speak with you about a serious violation of HOA regulations." "Is that right?" I leaned against the door frame, not inviting her in. The cold air rushed past her into my warm house, and I saw her eyes narrow as she noticed the comfortable temperature inside. "You are running a generator," she said, her voice rising slightly. "That is expressly prohibited during power outages according to Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the HOA bylaws. I had read the bylaws, every single tedious page of them, and I knew exactly what Section 12, Paragraph 4 said. That section prohibits generators that exceed 85 decibels or that run on improperly stored fuel. My generator is well within the noise limits, and my fuel storage meets all local fire codes. Brenda's face flushed red. That is not the point. The point is that you are using excessive power during an emergency situation when everyone else in the neighborhood is suffering through this outage together. So you want me to be cold because everyone else is cold. That is not how emergencies work, Brenda. It is about community solidarity, she snapped. And furthermore, I can see from here that you have a space heater running. Those are explicitly forbidden in the bylaws. Now I was getting annoyed. Show me where it says that. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through what I assumed was a digital copy of the bylaws. After a moment of searching, she said, Section 18, Paragraph 2. No resident shall operate high-wattage appliances that pose a fire hazard to the community. Space heaters are not specifically mentioned in that section, I countered. And mine does not pose any fire hazard. It is a commercial-grade unit with every safety certification you could imagine. I do not care what grade it is, Brenda said, her voice becoming shrill. You need to turn it off immediately, or I will have no choice but to issue a fine. You cannot fine me for using a safe, legal appliance in my own home during a power outage. We will see about that. She turned on her heel and marched back down the driveway, pulling out her phone as she went. I could hear her already making a call, probably to one of her cronies on the HOA board. I closed the door and went back to my coffee, trying not to let the interaction ruin my morning. But I knew Brenda well enough to realize this was not over. She was the type of person who could not stand being told no, especially not by someone she considered beneath her authority. The power stayed out through the morning and into the afternoon. I worked from home anyway, so the outage did not affect my job much. I had my laptop fully charged, and my internet modem was on the backup power system as well. Around noon, I made myself a sandwich and settled in for a video conference with my team. I worked as a software developer for a healthcare technology company, which was actually how I had learned about the commercial-grade space heater in the first place. One of my colleagues had mentioned it during a conversation about hospital infrastructure, and I had immediately seen the value in having something that reliable. At 2 in the afternoon, my doorbell rang again. This time, when I opened it, I found not just Brenda but 2 other members of the HOA board. There was Margaret Schultz, the vice president, a thin woman in her late 50s with a perpetually pinched expression, and Donald Harper, the treasurer, a balding man in his 60s who always wore khakis and polo shirts like he was on his way to a country club. Adam Brennan, Brenda said formally, as if we were in a courtroom. We are here on official HOA business to inspect your property for violations. You cannot just inspect my property without notice, I said, blocking the doorway. That is not how this works. Section 23 of the bylaws allows for emergency inspections when there is reasonable suspicion of a safety violation, Donald said, adjusting his glasses. There is no safety violation. There is just you 3 being angry that I am comfortable while you are cold. Let us in, or we will have no choice but to escalate this matter, Margaret said, her voice as sharp as broken glass. I considered my options. I could refuse and let them escalate, whatever that meant, or I could let them in, show them that my setup was completely safe and hopefully put an end to this nonsense. Against my better judgment, I chose the latter. Fine, come in. They filed into my house, and I could see them all taking note of the warm temperature. Brenda was practically vibrating with anger as she looked around. "Where is this space heater?" she demanded. "In my office." I led them down the hall to the room where I kept it. The heater was sitting in the corner, its digital display showing the current temperature and power usage. It was running quietly, efficiently, doing exactly what it was designed to do. Brenda walked up to it and stared at it as if it were some kind of dangerous weapon. "This thing must be using an enormous amount of power." "Actually, it is very efficient. It uses about 1,500 watts, which is standard for most space heaters, but it distributes the heat much more effectively because of the commercial-grade components." "I do not care about the components," she said, straightening up. "This is a violation, and I am issuing you a formal citation. You have 24 hours to remove this device from your property, or you will be fined $500. You cannot be serious." "I am completely serious. This is about the safety of our community." "Then I want proof that this heater is unsafe. Get an electrician to inspect it. If a licensed professional says it is a hazard, I will get rid of it. But if they say it is fine, you drop this whole thing and leave me alone." Brenda looked at Margaret and Donald, who both nodded. "Fine," Brenda said. "We will bring in an electrician, but you are paying for it." "That is fine with me, as long as they are actually qualified and not just someone's cousin who watched a YouTube video." "We will get someone reputable," Donald said, pulling out his phone. "I know a guy who does work for the city. His name is Rick Sanderson. He is very thorough." "Great, set it up." They left shortly after, and I sat down at my desk, wondering if I had just made a mistake by agreeing to this. But I knew my heater was safe. There was no possible way a licensed electrician could find anything wrong with it. Rick Sanderson arrived the next morning at 9. The power was still out, and the utility company had updated their estimate to sometime in the next 48 hours. Apparently, the outage had been caused by a major equipment failure at a substation, and they were waiting for replacement parts to be shipped in from Ohio. Rick was a guy in his mid-40s with a weathered face and calloused hands, the kind of person who actually knew what he was doing. He showed up in a work van with his company name painted on the side, and he carried a professional toolkit and testing equipment. Brenda, Margaret, and Donald were already waiting on my front lawn when he arrived, like vultures circling a wounded animal. I invited Rick inside and showed him to my office. "So what is the issue here?" Rick asked, setting down his equipment. "There is no issue," I said. "The HOA thinks my space heater is dangerous, and I think they are just being petty because I am the only person in the neighborhood with heat right now." Rick looked at the heater and let out a low whistle. "This is a nice unit. Where did you get this?" "Medical equipment supplier." "It is the same model they use in hospitals." "Yeah, I can see that." He bent down and examined the label on the back. "This is a Risto Temp 3000. We installed a bunch of these at Mercy General last year. These things are bulletproof." That is what I told them. Rick spent the next 20 minutes conducting a thorough inspection. He checked the electrical connections, tested the circuit it was running on, examined the safety features, and even used a thermal imaging camera to check for hot spots or potential fire hazards. Through it all, Brenda and her crew stood in the doorway, watching with expressions that ranged from skeptical to outright hostile. Finally, Rick stood up and turned to face them. "This is one of the safest space heaters I have ever seen. The build quality is exceptional, the safety features exceed all residential and commercial codes, and the installation is perfect. There is absolutely no hazard here." Brenda's face went through several shades of red before settling on a deep crimson. "That cannot be right. Check it again." "Madam, I just spent 20 minutes checking it. This heater is safer than 99% of the heating systems in this neighborhood. If you want my professional opinion, every house in this community should have one of these." But it is using so much power, Margaret interjected. It is using 1,500 watts, Rick said patiently. That is less than most hair dryers, and considering it is keeping this entire room warm during a power outage, it is actually remarkably efficient. See, I said, unable to keep the satisfaction out of my voice. I told you there was no problem. Brenda looked like she wanted to explode. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, and her jaw was so tight I thought she might crack a tooth. This is not over, she said finally. We will find something. There has to be a violation somewhere. Madam, with all due respect, this gentleman is not violating any codes or regulations, Rick said firmly. If you try to force him to remove this heater, you would be creating an unsafe situation by making him rely on a less effective heating method during an emergency. Whose side are you on? Brenda practically screamed. I am on the side of electrical safety and common sense, Rick said, packing up his equipment. Now, if you will excuse me, I have actual emergencies to deal with. I walked Rick to the door and thanked him for his time. He waved off my thanks and said, Those HOA types are all the same. They care more about control than about actual safety. You did the right thing by investing in quality equipment. After he left, I turned to face Brenda and her board members. I believe that settles it. It settles nothing, Brenda said. I am going to review every single line of the bylaws until I find something you are violating, and when I do, you will pay for making me look foolish. You are making yourself look foolish, I said, my patience finally wearing thin. Just admit that you are angry because I planned ahead and you did not. How dare you, she sputtered. I am the president of this HOA and you will show me respect. Respect is earned, Brenda, and right now, you are not earning it. She turned and stormed off, with Margaret and Donald following behind her like obedient puppies. I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling exhausted. The encounter had drained me more than I wanted to admit. The power came back on that evening around 7. I was actually a little disappointed because I had been enjoying the peace and quiet of the generator. But life returned to normal, and I figured that was the end of the space heater controversy. I was wrong. 3 days later, I received a formal letter in the mail from the HOA. It was printed on official letterhead and signed by all 3 board members. The letter stated that while the space heater itself had been deemed safe, I was in violation of Section 15, Paragraph 8, which prohibited modifications to home electrical systems without prior written approval from the HOA Architectural Review Committee. I read the letter 3 times trying to understand what they were talking about. Then it clicked. They were going after my backup power system, the dedicated circuit and generator that I had installed. The thing was, I had gotten approval for that installation. It had been 18 months ago, right after the previous winter's outage. I had submitted the proper forms, included the electrical plans, and even paid the $200 review fee. The approval had come back in writing, signed by the previous HOA president, a reasonable man named Frank Morrison, who had since moved to Arizona. I went to my filing cabinet and pulled out the folder where I kept all my HOA documentation. Sure enough, there was the approval letter, dated 18 months ago, clearly stating that the installation of a backup power system with a dedicated circuit was permitted. I scanned the letter and sent it via email to Brenda, Margaret, and Donald, along with a brief message stating that I had received proper approval and that their violation notice was therefore invalid. The response came back in less than an hour. It was from Brenda, and it was just 2 sentences long. The previous board's decisions are under review. Your approval is not valid until confirmed by the current board. That was when I realized this had gone beyond a simple busybody HOA president being annoying. This was harassment, plain and simple. Brenda was making up rules and retroactively applying them just to punish me for having the audacity to keep my house warm during an outage. I decided it was time to fight back, but I needed to do it the right way. I started by making copies of all my documentation: the original approval letter, the electrical inspection reports from the city, the bylaws with the relevant sections highlighted, and Rick Sanderson's written report confirming the safety of my space heater. Then I started researching Michigan HOA law. What I found was enlightening. Michigan had specific statutes governing homeowners associations, and several of them had been strengthened in recent years to protect homeowners from exactly this kind of abuse. For example, an HOA could not retroactively invalidate approvals that had been granted in writing. They also could not selectively enforce rules against specific homeowners as a form of harassment. And perhaps most importantly, homeowners had the right to sue the HOA for damages if they could prove that the board was acting in bad faith. I printed out the relevant statutes and added them to my documentation folder. Then I wrote a formal response to the HOA's violation notice, citing the specific laws they were breaking and demanding that they cease their harassment immediately. I sent the letter via certified mail so I would have proof of delivery. 2 days later, I got a call from Donald Harper. His voice was tense when he spoke. "Adam, this is Donald from the HOA board. I wanted to discuss your letter." "What is there to discuss?" "I have documentation proving that I received proper approval for my electrical system, and Michigan law is clear that you cannot retroactively invalidate that approval." "Yes. Well, Brenda seems to think that there are extenuating circumstances." "What extenuating circumstances?" "I followed all the rules, paid all the fees, and got everything approved in writing. There is nothing extenuating about that." Donald was quiet for a moment. "Look, between you and me, I think Brenda is taking this too far. But she is convinced that you are undermining her authority, and she is determined to find some way to punish you for it. So you are admitting that this is retaliation." "I did not say that," Donald said quickly. "I am just trying to give you some insight into the situation." "Here is some insight for you, Donald. If Brenda keeps this up, I am going to sue the HOA for harassment. And based on the research I have done, I have a pretty strong case. The court can award damages, legal fees, and even remove board members who are found to be acting in bad faith." "Is that really what you want?" Another long silence. "I will talk to Brenda," he said finally. "Maybe we can find a way to resolve this without things getting ugly." "Things are already ugly, Donald, but yes, please talk to her, because I am not backing down on this." The call ended, and I felt a grim satisfaction. I did not want to sue anybody. Lawsuits were expensive and time-consuming, even if you won. But I was not going to let Brenda bully me into removing equipment that I had legally installed, and that served a genuine safety purpose. For about a week, things were quiet. I started to think that maybe Donald had gotten through to Brenda, and she had decided to drop the whole thing. I should have known better. On a Saturday morning, I was in my garage organizing some tools when I heard a vehicle pull up in my driveway. I walked out to see a white pickup truck with the logo of a local electrical contracting company. A man in his 30s got out, holding a clipboard. "Adam Brennan," he asked. "That is me. Can I help you?" "I am here to disconnect your backup power system. I have a work order from the HOA." I felt my blood pressure spike. "Excuse me." He held up the clipboard, showing me a form with Brenda's signature at the bottom. "Says here that the system was installed without proper permits and needs to be removed immediately." "That is completely false." I have all the permits, including city approval and HOA approval. This is harassment." The contractor looked uncomfortable. "Look, man, I am just doing my job. I get paid to follow work orders." "Well, you are not touching my electrical system. If you try, I will call the police and have you arrested for vandalism." "Come on, do not make this difficult." "I am not the one making it difficult. Brenda Patterson is lying to you. I can show you all my documentation right now if you want to see it." The contractor hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. "She said you might cause trouble." Of course she did. But think about it. If you disconnect a legally installed electrical system without the homeowner's permission, you are committing a crime. You could lose your license. "Is whatever Brenda is paying you worth that risk?" That got through to him. He looked down at his clipboard, then back at me. "You really have all the permits, every single one. Come inside and I will show you." I brought him into my office and showed him the entire folder of documentation. He spent several minutes reviewing it, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "This is all legit," he said finally. "The city signed off on it, the HOA signed off on it. I do not understand why she said it was not permitted. Because she is lying to get what she wants. She is angry that I would not bow to her authority, so now she is making things up to punish me." The contractor shook his head. "Man, HOAs are the worst. I deal with this stuff all the time. People get a little bit of power and they lose their minds. So you are not going to disconnect anything?" "Hell no. I am not risking my license for some crazy HOA lady. I am going to call her right now and tell her the job is canceled." He made the call while standing in my driveway. I could not hear Brenda's side of the conversation, but I could hear him. "Madam, I am looking at city permits and HOA approval documents. Everything is legitimate. I understand you believe that, but I am telling you the paperwork is valid. No, madam, I will not do the work without proper documentation showing the system is actually illegal. That is your prerogative, but I am not coming back unless you have a court order." He hung up and shook his head. "She is furious, said she is going to report me to the city." "For what? Refusing to commit vandalism?" "Yeah, pretty much. Like I said, HOAs are the worst." He climbed back into his truck and drove away, leaving me standing in the driveway, equal parts relieved and angry. This had officially crossed the line from annoying to illegal. Brenda had attempted to have my property damaged based on false pretenses. That was not just harassment anymore. That was destruction of property, or at least attempted destruction. I went back inside and called a lawyer. I had been hoping to avoid this, but Brenda had left me no choice. I needed legal representation, and I needed to make it clear that her behavior had consequences. The lawyer I contacted was named Patricia Chen, and she specialized in HOA disputes. Her office was in downtown Grand Rapids, in one of those old renovated buildings with brick walls and tall windows. I met with her on Monday afternoon, bringing my entire folder of documentation. Patricia was in her early 40s, with short black hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She listened as I explained the entire situation, from the initial power outage to Brenda's attempt to have my electrical system disconnected. She took notes and occasionally asked clarifying questions. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and tapped her pen against her notepad. "This is pretty clear-cut harassment. You have documentation for everything, you have followed all the rules, and the HOA president is making up violations to retaliate against you. So what are my options? You have several. The first is to file a formal complaint with the HOA, requesting that Brenda be removed from her position for misconduct. The second is to file a lawsuit against the HOA for harassment and attempted property damage. The third is to do both. What would you recommend?" I would recommend starting with the complaint. It is less expensive and less time-consuming than a lawsuit, and it might be enough to solve the problem. If the other board members see the evidence you have, they might decide to rein Brenda in or remove her entirely. And if they do not, then we escalate to a lawsuit. And honestly, based on what you have told me, I think you would win. Michigan courts have been very protective of homeowners in cases like this, especially when there is evidence of bad faith on the part of the HOA board. I hired Patricia on the spot and authorized her to file the formal complaint. She drafted it that afternoon, a detailed document outlining every incident, supported by copies of all my documentation. The complaint was sent to every member of the HOA board, as well as to the HOA's management company. The response was swift and dramatic. 3 days after the complaint was filed, I received a phone call from the management company. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Linda Torres, the regional manager. "Mr. Brennan, I have reviewed your complaint and I have to say, I am very concerned about what I am seeing. That is putting it mildly. I want you to know that the management company does not condone this kind of behavior. We work with hundreds of HOAs across Michigan, and we have very clear policies about board conduct. What Ms. Patterson has been doing is not acceptable. So, what happens now? I am calling an emergency board meeting for this Saturday. You are invited to attend, and I encourage you to bring your lawyer. The board will review the complaint and determine the appropriate action, which should be removing Brenda from her position. That is one option that will be on the table," Linda said carefully. "I cannot promise you a specific outcome, but I can promise that this will be taken seriously." Saturday could not come fast enough. I spent the intervening days going over everything with Patricia, making sure we had all our facts straight and our documentation organized. Patricia assured me that we had a strong case, but she also warned me that Brenda was unlikely to go down without a fight. The meeting was held at the community center, a small building at the entrance to Riverside Meadows that was normally used for neighborhood events. When Patricia and I arrived, the room was already full. All 5 members of the HOA board were there, along with Linda Torres from the management company. Brenda sat at the head of the table, looking defiant. Linda called the meeting to order and explained the purpose of the gathering. She then invited me to present my case. I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I had prepared a short presentation, using printed photos and documents to illustrate each point. I started with the power outage and my use of the space heater, explaining how I had invested in commercial-grade equipment specifically for safety reasons. I showed the inspection report from Rick Sanderson, confirming that the heater was not only safe, but exceeded all applicable standards. Then I moved on to the backup power system, showing the original approval letter from the previous board and the city permits. I explained how Brenda had tried to retroactively invalidate the approval, despite Michigan law clearly prohibiting that practice. Finally, I described the incident with the electrical contractor, how Brenda had issued a work order to disconnect my system based on false information. I had even obtained a written statement from the contractor confirming the conversation and his refusal to do the work. "The pattern here is clear," I said, looking directly at Brenda. "This is not about safety or HOA rules. This is about retaliation. Miss Patterson is angry that I refused to bow to her authority, and she has been abusing her position to punish me. That is not just unprofessional, it is illegal." Patricia then stood up and provided a legal analysis, citing the specific Michigan statutes that Brenda had violated. She explained the potential consequences, both for Brenda personally and for the HOA as an organization. "If this pattern of behavior continues," Patricia said, Mr. Brennan has grounds to sue the HOA for harassment, and potentially to sue Miss Patterson personally for abuse of authority. The damages could be substantial, and the legal fees would be paid by the HOA, meaning by all the homeowners in this community. Is that really what you want? Linda Torres spoke up. Miss Patterson, do you have a response to these allegations? Brenda stood up, her face flushed with anger. This is all blown out of proportion. I was simply trying to enforce the rules and keep the community safe. By trying to have legal equipment disconnected, I said. By ignoring written approvals and safety inspections. You are twisting everything to make me look bad, Brenda shot back. You are the one who caused all this trouble by refusing to follow the rules like everyone else. I did follow the rules, I said, my voice rising. I have documentation proving that I followed every single rule. What you are doing is making up new rules to justify your harassment. Order, please, Linda said firmly. She turned to the other board members. I would like to hear from the rest of the board. Mr. Harper, Miss Schultz, what is your position on this matter? Donald Harper looked uncomfortable. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. I have to admit, I have been concerned about the direction this has taken. Adam did provide documentation showing prior approval for his electrical system. I am not sure we had the authority to challenge that. Margaret Schultz was less conciliatory. I support Brenda. She has been an excellent president, and I think Adam is just trying to cause trouble because he does not like being held accountable. The other two board members, a man named Gary Wu and a woman named Helen Torres, both indicated that they thought the situation had gotten out of hand and needed to be resolved. Linda Torres nodded. Based on what I have heard today, I am making the following recommendations to the board. First, all violation notices issued to Mr. Brennan regarding his space heater and backup power system should be rescinded immediately. The documentation clearly shows that he has complied with all applicable rules and regulations. This is outrageous, Brenda interrupted. Please let me finish, Linda said sharply. Second, I am recommending that the board vote to remove Miss Patterson from her position as president, effective immediately. Her conduct has exposed the HOA to significant legal liability, and it has violated the trust that homeowners place in their elected representatives. You cannot do that, Brenda said, her voice shaking. I was elected by the homeowners. And the board has the authority to remove officers for cause, Linda replied. That is in the HOA's governing documents. I am calling for a vote right now. All in favor of removing Brenda Patterson as president, Donald, Gary, and Helen all raised their hands. Margaret kept hers down, glaring at the others. The motion passes 3-1, Linda said. Miss Patterson, you are removed from your position as president. You will remain on the board as a regular member, but you will have no executive authority. Brenda looked like she had been slapped. Her face went from red to white, and for a moment I thought she might pass out. Then she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The rest of the meeting was devoted to appointing Donald Harper as interim president and discussing how to prevent similar situations in the future. Patricia and I left feeling vindicated, though I knew this was not quite over yet. True to form, Brenda did not accept her removal quietly. Over the next few weeks, she launched what could only be described as a campaign of petty revenge. She started sending emails to all the homeowners in Riverside Meadows, claiming that I had manipulated the board and that the HOA was now under the control of people who did not care about community safety. Most homeowners ignored her emails, but a few took her side. I started getting dirty looks from some neighbors, and someone even left a nasty note on my car windshield accusing me of being a troublemaker. Patricia advised me to document everything, which I did. I saved all the emails, took photos of the note, and kept a log of every incident. She said that if Brenda's behavior continued, we might need to seek a restraining order. Things came to a head on a Thursday evening in mid-March. I was working late in my home office when I heard a crash from outside. I rushed to the window and saw Brenda standing in my driveway, holding a baseball bat. My car's windshield was shattered. I grabbed my phone and called 911 immediately. "I need police at 847 Riverside Drive. Someone just vandalized my car and they are still on the property." The dispatcher asked me to stay inside and keep the doors locked. I watched from the window as Brenda looked around wildly, as if trying to decide what to do next. She raised the bat again, and for a moment, I thought she was going to hit my car again. Instead, she turned toward my house. She walked up to my front door and started pounding on it with her fists. "You ruined my life," she screamed. "I was respected in this community and you turned everyone against me. Brenda, the police are on their way," I called through the door. "You need to leave right now." "I am not leaving until you admit what you did. You manipulated everyone. You made me look like a fool. You did that yourself by harassing me and breaking the law." She let out a scream of pure rage and swung the bat at my front door. The wood cracked but did not break. She swung again and again, each impact sending shudders through the door frame. I heard sirens in the distance, getting closer. Brenda must have heard them too because she suddenly stopped swinging and looked around in panic. She dropped the bat and started running toward her car, which was parked on the street. She did not make it. 2 Grand Rapids Police Department cruisers came around the corner, lights flashing, and blocked her path. Officers jumped out with their hands on their weapons. "Stop right there. Hands up." Brenda froze, then slowly raised her hands. She was crying now, her earlier rage dissolved into tears. "I just wanted to talk to him," she sobbed. "He ruined everything." The officers approached carefully and handcuffed her. One of them came to my door and knocked. "Mr. Brennan." "This is the Grand Rapids Police. You can come out now." I opened the door, taking in the damage. There were several deep gouges in the wood and the door frame was cracked. My car windshield was completely destroyed. "Are you hurt?" the officer asked. He was a young guy, maybe late 20s, with a serious expression. "No, I am fine. She did not get inside." "Can you tell me what happened?" I gave him the full story, starting with the HOA dispute and ending with tonight's attack. Another officer took photos of the damage while I spoke. A third officer was putting Brenda into the back of a cruiser. She was still crying, her face streaked with tears and mascara. "This is definitely going to result in charges," the officer said, making notes. "Criminal damage to property, attempted breaking and entering, possibly assault if she threatened you verbally." "She has been harassing me for weeks," I said. "My lawyer has documentation of everything." "You will want to provide that to the prosecutor." "This looks like a clear case of escalating behavior. The court will want to see the full pattern." The officers spent about an hour on the scene, taking statements and collecting evidence. They took the baseball bat, which Brenda had apparently brought from her own home. One officer told me it had her initials carved into the handle, which struck me as both pathetic and darkly funny. After they left, I called Patricia and told her what had happened. She was shocked but not entirely surprised. "This is actually good for your case," she said. "Not that I am happy about the damage, but it proves that her behavior has been escalating and that she poses a genuine threat. The criminal charges will support our civil case if we need to pursue damages." "What happens now?" "Now you file a police report, which you have already done. You get estimates for repairing the damage to your car and door, and you wait for the prosecutor to file charges. Based on what you have told me, I would expect her to be charged with at least one felony and several misdemeanors. And the HOA should cover your damages. This happened as a direct result of an HOA dispute, and Brenda was still a board member at the time of the attack. The HOA's insurance should pay for repairs. Over the next few days, the story spread through Riverside Meadows like wildfire. Most of my neighbors were sympathetic, apologizing for not speaking up earlier when Brenda had been sending her emails. A few people admitted that they had been afraid of her, worried that she would target them the same way she had targeted me. The HOA held another emergency meeting and voted to remove Brenda from the board entirely. They also issued a formal apology to me and confirmed that the HOA's insurance would cover all damages. Brenda was formally charged 2 weeks later. The prosecutor filed 3 counts: felony criminal damage to property, attempted burglary, and misdemeanor assault. Her bail was set at $10,000, which her husband apparently paid, though rumors circulated that he was planning to divorce her. The criminal case moved slowly through the system, as these things do. I had to give a deposition, which was surprisingly tedious. The prosecutor asked me hundreds of questions about every detail of my interactions with Brenda. Patricia was there to represent me, making sure I did not say anything that could hurt any potential civil case. The HOA, meanwhile, was going through its own reckoning. Donald Harper, now the permanent president, instituted a series of reforms designed to prevent future abuses of power. The board created a formal appeals process for homeowners who disagreed with HOA decisions. They also established term limits for board members and required annual training on HOA law and ethics. My car was repaired, my door was replaced, and life slowly returned to normal. I kept using my space heater and my backup power system, and nobody said a word about it. Brenda's criminal trial took place in August, 5 months after the attack. Patricia and I attended, sitting in the gallery as the prosecutor presented the case. The evidence was overwhelming: police reports, photos of the damage, my testimony, and even security camera footage from a neighbor's house that showed Brenda swinging the bat at my car. Her defense attorney tried to argue that she had been under extreme emotional distress, that the HOA dispute had pushed her to a breaking point. The judge was not impressed. "Miss Patterson," the judge said, "you held a position of trust in your community. Instead of using that position responsibly, you abused it to harass a homeowner who was simply trying to exercise his legal rights. When you were removed from your position, instead of accepting the consequences of your actions, you escalated to violence. This court cannot excuse that behavior." Brenda was found guilty on all 3 counts. The judge sentenced her to 2 years in prison, suspended after 6 months with 3 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution for all damages, including my legal fees, and to undergo anger management counseling. As she was led out of the courtroom, Brenda looked at me one last time. There was no anger in her eyes anymore, just defeat and exhaustion. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. After the criminal case concluded, Patricia and I discussed whether to pursue a civil lawsuit for additional damages. I decided against it. Brenda was already facing prison time and financial ruin. I had been vindicated, my property had been repaired, and the HOA had implemented reforms to prevent future problems. Continuing to pursue her legally felt less like justice and more like revenge. "I just want to move on," I told Patricia. "I want to live in peace and not think about Brenda Patterson anymore." "That is completely understandable," Patricia said. "You have been through enough." I paid Patricia's final invoice, thanked her for her excellent work, and closed that chapter of my life. The following winter, when the temperatures dropped and the snow started falling, I set up my space heater again. There was no power outage that year, but it was nice to have the extra warmth on particularly cold nights. Sometimes neighbors would stop by to see it. Word had spread about the hospital-grade heater, and people were curious. I would show them the features, explain how it worked, and recommend the model if they were interested. Several people in Riverside Meadows ended up buying their own units, and I like to think I had made the community a little bit safer and more prepared for emergencies. Donald Harper turned out to be a good HOA president. He was reasonable, responsive, and actually seemed to care about what homeowners wanted rather than imposing his own will. The board met regularly and published detailed minutes, so everyone knew what was happening. The whole atmosphere of Riverside Meadows changed, becoming more collaborative and less authoritarian. Brenda served her 6 months at the Kent County Jail and was released on probation. She and her husband did divorce, and she moved out of Riverside Meadows shortly after her release. I heard she was living in an apartment across town and working at a grocery store. Part of me hoped she had learned something from the experience, that she had recognized how her need for control had destroyed her life and hurt other people. But mostly, I did not think about her at all. I had my house, my job, my space heater, and my peace of mind. The HOA drama was behind me, and I was determined to keep it that way. One evening in December, about 2 years after the whole mess had started, I was sitting in my office with the space heater running, working on a particularly challenging piece of code. Snow was falling outside, and the house was warm and comfortable. My backup generator sat ready in the garage just in case, but I had not needed it yet that winter. There was a knock at my door. I got up to answer it and found Gary Wu, one of the HOA board members, standing on my porch with a plate of cookies. "Hey, Adam," he said. "My wife made these for the neighbors. Thought you might like some." "Thanks, Gary. That is really nice. Also wanted to let you know that the board is thinking of putting together an emergency preparedness guide for the community. We thought you might want to contribute given your experience." "I would be happy to help." "Great. We are meeting next week at the community center. Nothing formal, just sharing ideas. You should come." "I will be there." After Gary left, I sat down with the cookies and thought about how much things had changed. 2 years ago, the HOA had been trying to punish me for being prepared. Now they were asking for my advice. It was not the resolution I would have predicted, but it felt right. The Emergency Preparedness Committee met regularly through that winter and into the spring. We put together a comprehensive guide covering everything from backup power to emergency supplies to communication plans. The guide was distributed to every household in Riverside Meadows, and several people told me it had been genuinely helpful. I also got involved in other community activities. I joined the Neighborhood Watch, helped organize a summer block party, and even volunteered to serve on the HOA's Architectural Review Committee. It turned out that being part of an HOA did not have to mean constant conflict and power struggles. When the board was filled with reasonable people who genuinely wanted to serve the community, it could actually be a positive force. My space heater remained in my office, a quiet symbol of everything that had happened. Occasionally, when I was working late and the temperature dropped, I would turn it on and feel that blast of warm air. It reminded me that sometimes standing up for what was right meant conflict and struggle, but it was worth it in the end. The legal bills had been significant, and the stress of the whole situation had taken its toll. But I had learned something valuable about myself. I had learned that I could face down a bully, even one who had institutional power behind her. I had learned that documentation and preparation were more powerful than anger and intimidation. And I had learned that communities could change for the better when people were willing to speak up and demand accountability. I thought about all the people who had dealt with similar situations, homeowners across the country who faced HOA boards that abused their authority. Some of those people probably backed down, deciding it was not worth the fight. I understood that impulse. Fighting was exhausting and expensive, and there were no guarantees of success. But I was glad I had fought, not just for myself, but for everyone in Riverside Meadows who had been too afraid to stand up to Brenda. My willingness to document everything, hire a lawyer, and see the process through had resulted in real change. The reforms Donald had implemented meant that future homeowners would not have to deal with the same kind of harassment that I had endured. The space heater hummed quietly in the corner, doing exactly what it was designed to do: keep people safe and warm in difficult conditions. In a way, that was what I had tried to do too, not just for myself, but for my community. Years would pass, and I would eventually move out of Riverside Meadows. I would take the space heater with me, of course. It had cost too much and meant too much to leave behind. But I would always remember that winter when a simple appliance had become the center of a battle over principle and authority. The story became something of a legend in Grand Rapids. Patricia Chen used it as a case study when she taught seminars on HOA law. Rick Sanderson told it to his electrician buddies as an example of HOA overreach. And in Riverside Meadows, new homeowners would occasionally hear about the heater incident and shake their heads in disbelief that it had really happened. But it had happened, every absurd, infuriating, ultimately vindicating minute of it. And in the end, justice had prevailed. The system had worked the way it was supposed to work. Documentation, legal process, and simple persistence had overcome abuse of authority. I would sometimes wonder what Brenda was doing, whether she had managed to rebuild her life after prison and probation. I hoped she had found some peace, that she had learned to let go of her need for control and power. But I never reached out to her, and she never contacted me. That chapter was closed for both of us. My life moved on in ways I had not anticipated. The publicity from the case, there had been a few articles in the Grand Rapids press, had led to some interesting opportunities. I was invited to speak at a homeowners' rights conference in Lansing, sharing my experience and offering advice to others facing similar situations. I found that I enjoyed advocacy work, helping people understand their rights and navigate complex HOA disputes. I even considered going to law school for a while, though I ultimately decided I was happy with my career in software development. But I stayed involved in homeowners' rights issues, volunteering with a nonprofit that provided free legal information to people dealing with HOA problems. The space heater, that commercial-grade Risto Temp 3000 that had started everything, continued to serve me faithfully. It never broke down, never failed, never gave me a moment of trouble. It was exactly what I had paid for: reliable, safe, and effective. Every time I used it, I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that I had made the right choice in buying it and the right choice in defending my right to use it. Sometimes the smallest things, a space heater, a power outage, a petty dispute, could spiral into something much larger. But they could also be opportunities. Opportunities to stand up for principle, to demand accountability, to make things better not just for yourself but for everyone around you. As I sat in my office that final winter in Riverside Meadows, with my space heater running and my backup generator ready, I felt a sense of peace. The battle was over, the reforms were in place, and the community was stronger for having gone through the struggle. I would never forget Brenda Patterson and her attempted reign of terror over my space heater. but I would not let that experience define me or embitter me. Instead, I would let it remind me that ordinary people could stand up to unreasonable authority, that the system could work when people were willing to fight for what was right, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought over the smallest things. The space heater hummed on, warming my office, a testament to quality engineering and stubborn principle. And I returned to my work, content in the knowledge that I had fought the good fight and won.